Most wealthy people leave evidence behind. A larger house, an expensive watch, a luxury car parked in the driveway, a lifestyle that quietly announces success before a single word is spoken. Grace Groner left none of it. If you had walked through the streets of Lake Forest, Illinois, sometime in the early 2000s, you might have passed an elderly woman making her way into the grocery store with a handful of coupons folded neatly in her pocket. She wore the same practical winter coat year after year. She walked instead of driving. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment above an old movie theater. Nothing about her suggested wealth. Nothing about her attracted attention. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Then, in January 2010, Grace Groner died at the age of 100. A few weeks later, a lawyer contacted Lake Forest College, the small liberal arts college she had graduated from nearly 8 decades earlier. His message lasted only a few minutes. It left the college speechless. Grace Groner, the quiet, retired secretary almost everyone remembered, had left the school nearly $7 million. The number didn't seem possible. Faculty members remembered seeing her at alumni events. Local residents remembered her walking through town. Former co-workers remembered her as polite, dependable, and remarkably private. No one remembered a millionaire, because Grace had spent her entire life making sure nobody would. So where had $7 million come from? Not from inherited wealth. Not from owning a successful business. Not from real estate. Not from a lottery ticket. The answer had been growing quietly for 75 years. Hidden inside a decision so ordinary that history barely noticed it when it happened. 3 shares, worth just $180. But before we follow that investment, we have to understand the person who made it. Because Grace Groner's greatest asset wasn't money. It was the way she thought. Grace Evelyn Groner was born on January 4th, 1909, on a small farm in Illinois alongside her twin sister Gladys. The sisters grew up in a rural America that looked very different from the country we know today. Electricity had not yet reached many farming communities. Most families depended on hard physical work simply to get through each season. Money was limited. Security was fragile. Then tragedy arrived early. When the girls were around 12 years old, both of their parents died. In a single moment, their childhood changed forever. 2 young sisters suddenly faced a future with no parents to guide them and very little certainty about what came next. For many children, that kind of loss closes doors. For Grace, one unexpected act of generosity opened a new one. A local family, the Andersons, stepped forward and helped the girls continue their education. They were not immediate relatives. There was no obligation, only kindness. Years later, people close to Grace would often describe her as deeply grateful but intensely private. She rarely spoke about her own hardships. She rarely spoke about money. But those who studied her life believe that the generosity shown to her as a child never left her. It became part of the way she understood the world. In 1931, Grace graduated from Lake Forest College. It should have been the beginning of a promising career. Instead, she stepped into one of the darkest economic moments in American history. The United States was sinking deeper into the Great Depression. By then, thousands of banks had already failed. Businesses disappeared almost overnight. Factories stood silent. Across the country, millions of Americans searched desperately for work, while long bread lines became an ordinary part of city life. A college degree no longer guaranteed opportunity. It barely guaranteed employment. Against those odds, Grace found work as a secretary at Abbott Laboratories, a growing pharmaceutical company headquartered just north of Chicago. Her responsibilities were ordinary: typing correspondence, organizing files, keeping records. Nothing about the job suggested she was standing at the beginning of one of the greatest long-term investing stories ever documented. Yet history has a habit of hiding its biggest turning points inside completely ordinary moments. No headlines announced what was coming. No newspaper predicted it. No one inside Abbott Laboratories looked at the young secretary walking through its doors each morning and imagined that decades later, universities would teach her story as one of the clearest real-world examples of patience, discipline, and the extraordinary power of compounding. because 4 years later, Grace Groner would spend $180 to everyone around her. It looked like an ordinary financial decision. To history, it would become the beginning of an extraordinary experiment, one that would last 75 years. In the spring of 1935, Grace Groner was 26 years old. Every weekday, she arrived at Abbott Laboratories before the workday began. She unlocked filing cabinets, typed letters, organized company records, answered correspondence. Her routine rarely changed. It was the kind of job people forgot about the moment they left the office. Grace wasn't building a career people would admire. She was building a life she could depend on. One afternoon, she made a financial decision so ordinary that no one around her would have remembered it the next day. She purchased 3 shares of Abbott Laboratories. The price came to $180. There was no celebration, no dramatic music, no newspaper headline announcing that an ordinary secretary had just made one of the greatest long-term investments in American history. The transaction lasted only a few minutes. The consequences would last 3/4 of a century. Here's what makes that moment so extraordinary. Grace had absolutely no way of knowing what Abbott Laboratories would eventually become. In 1935, Abbott was already a respected pharmaceutical company, but it was far from the global healthcare giant we recognize today. Founded in 1888 by Chicago physician Dr. Wallace C. Abbott, the company had earned its reputation by producing standardized medicines at a time when medical treatments often varied widely in quality. That commitment to scientific consistency helped Abbott survive an era in which thousands of American businesses simply disappeared. But surviving wasn't the same as becoming extraordinary. From Grace's perspective, Abbott wasn't a guaranteed success. It was simply a company she understood, a place where she worked, a business she believed had a future. That distinction matters, because one of the biggest myths in investing is that successful investors can predict the future. They can't. The most successful long-term investors don't see the future more clearly than everyone else. They simply recognize quality and then give it time. Grace never claimed to be a financial expert. She never studied economics. She never tried to forecast recessions. She never searched for the next company that would multiply 100 times. Instead, she quietly became an owner. That's an important difference. Most people think like customers. Grace learned to think like an owner. Every time Abbott developed a new product, she benefited. Every time the company expanded, she benefited. Every time profits increased, she benefited. She wasn't working for Abbott alone anymore. She now owned a tiny piece of Abbott. And while Grace continued living her quiet life, Abbott quietly continued growing. Throughout the late 1930s, the company expanded its pharmaceutical research. Scientists worked to improve drug manufacturing. Production capacity increased. New markets slowly opened. None of it happened overnight. There were no explosive headlines, just years of small improvements, stacking on top of one another. Interestingly, Abbott and Grace were becoming remarkably similar. Neither attracted much public attention. Neither chased quick success. Both grew steadily, almost unnoticed. Then came something even more powerful. Every few months, Abbott rewarded its shareholders with dividends, a portion of the company's profits distributed to its owners. For many investors, that payment felt like free spending money. A dinner out, a household purchase, a short vacation. Grace saw something different. She saw another opportunity to own a little more of the same business. So instead of spending those dividend checks, she reinvested them. Again, and again, and again. Each new share produced future dividends. Those dividends bought even more shares. And those shares generated dividends of their own. The process looked almost invisible. For years, nothing about it seemed impressive. If someone had looked at Grace's investment after 5 years, they probably would have shrugged. Even after 10 years, it still wouldn't have looked extraordinary. This is the paradox that almost every new investor struggles to accept. Compounding is incredibly slow, until suddenly, it isn't. It rewards people in reverse. The greatest gains rarely appear at the beginning. They arrive after decades of consistency, which explains why so few people ever experience them. Most quit long before the mathematics become extraordinary. Grace didn't, not because she knew exactly what would happen, but because she never expected greatness to happen quickly. She understood something that Wall Street still struggles to sell. The market doesn't usually reward excitement. It rewards endurance. And over the next 50 years, history would test that endurance again, and again, and again. For the first few years, Grace's investment looked completely ordinary. There were no life-changing returns. No sudden fortune. No moment that convinced her she had made the decision of a lifetime. If anything, the investment rewarded patience with silence. And that's exactly where most people would have walked away. Because human beings aren't naturally wired to wait. We want proof that we're right. We want progress we can see. We want rewards that arrive before our confidence disappears. The market rarely works that way. Grace never demanded immediate results. She simply let the years accumulate. Then history began testing that decision. In 1939, Europe descended into war. Within 2 years, the United States had entered World War II. Factories across America transformed almost overnight. Automobile plants built military vehicles. Manufacturing lines were redesigned for wartime production. Pharmaceutical companies faced enormous pressure to supply medicines for millions of soldiers serving around the world. Abbott Laboratories expanded production to meet those demands, strengthening the company's position during one of the most consequential periods in modern industrial history. Grace continued reporting to work. She wasn't designing medicines. She wasn't making corporate decisions. She was still the quiet secretary walking through the same office doors every morning. But something had fundamentally changed. Every improvement Abbott made, every contract it won, every innovation it introduced, benefited not only the company, but one of its smallest shareholders, Grace. She had unknowingly tied her future to a business that continued creating value long after the original purchase. When the war ended, America entered one of the greatest economic expansions in its history. Families bought homes. Highways connected cities. Television entered living rooms. Healthcare advanced rapidly, and Abbott expanded alongside that new America. It invested heavily in scientific research, introduced breakthrough healthcare products, expanded internationally, built manufacturing facilities across new markets. Grace never appeared in annual reports. Her name was never mentioned in board meetings. Yet year after year, the value of her ownership quietly increased. And with every dividend, she made the same decision. Reinvest. No debate. No hesitation. No excitement. Just discipline. By now, her strategy had become almost mechanical. Not because investing was easy, but because she had removed emotion from the process. Modern behavioral finance tells us that investors rarely lose because markets are unpredictable. They lose because emotions are. Fear encourages people to sell after prices fall. Greed encourages them to buy after prices rise. The result is a cycle that quietly destroys long-term returns. Grace escaped that cycle, not by predicting the future, but by refusing to let temporary emotions rewrite a permanent plan. Then came the 1970s. Inflation surged across the United States. Oil prices exploded. Economic growth slowed. For many Americans, it felt as though the prosperity of previous decades had come to an end. Confidence in the stock market collapsed. Newspapers questioned whether investing in equities still made sense. Financial uncertainty became part of everyday conversation. Again, Grace did nothing. Then came another test. October 19th, 1987. A date now remembered simply as Black Monday. When trading closed that afternoon, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen 22.6% in a single day, still the largest one-day percentage decline in its history. Across the country, investors stared at television screens in disbelief. Brokerage firms were overwhelmed with calls. Some people sold because they believed the financial system itself was breaking apart. Others sold simply because everyone else was selling. Panic has always been contagious. History shows that markets eventually recover. Fear convinces people they never will. Grace ignored both the headlines and the crowd. Her shares remained exactly where they had always been. That decision would prove more valuable than any prediction Wall Street could offer. Because while millions of investors spent decades trying to outsmart the market, Grace was doing something much simpler. She was allowing time to do the work they expected intelligence to do. By the late 1990s, the investment no longer looked ordinary. The original 3 shares had multiplied repeatedly through stock splits. Decades of reinvested dividends had quietly increased her ownership year after year. What had once been a modest investment made from an ordinary secretary's salary had grown into a fortune. Yet if you visited Grace that same year, you would have seen nothing extraordinary. The same apartment, the same careful spending habits, the same quiet woman who never felt the need to prove her success to anyone. She had mastered something far more difficult than investing. She had mastered enough, and without realizing it, Grace Groner had become a millionaire. Almost no one knew. The biggest reveal of her life wouldn't happen until after she was gone. On January 7th, 2010, Grace Groner passed away peacefully. She was 100 years old. For the people who knew her, it was the quiet passing of a quiet woman. No television cameras gathered outside her apartment. No newspapers rushed to publish her obituary. There was nothing about that January morning to suggest that one of the most extraordinary investing stories in American history had just come to an end. Then, the paperwork was opened. Executors began reviewing Grace's estate. Lawyers contacted Lake Forest College. And almost overnight, a woman whom nearly everyone had considered financially ordinary became the center of an astonishing revelation. Grace Groner had accumulated nearly $7 million. Not through inheritance, not through entrepreneurship, not through speculation, but through a single investment, protected by 75 years of extraordinary patience. The news spread far beyond the small town where she had spent most of her life. Financial newspapers wrote about her. Investment professionals studied her. Ordinary families asked the same question. How could someone who lived so simply have accumulated so much? The answer wasn't hidden in a secret investing strategy. It was hidden in habits so ordinary that most people ignore them. Patience, consistency, humility, and the willingness to let time work longer than almost anyone else is prepared to wait. But perhaps the greatest surprise wasn't the size of her fortune. It was what she chose to do with it. Years before her death, Grace had established the Grace Groner Foundation. In her will, she directed that nearly her entire estate be used to support Lake Forest College, the very institution that had helped shape the course of her own life. The funds would provide scholarships, support internships, create opportunities for students to study abroad, and help young people whose futures might otherwise be limited by financial hardship. Think about that for a moment. When Grace was a frightened 12-year-old girl, someone invested in her future, not by buying shares, but by believing she deserved an education. Decades later, Grace returned that investment, not to one child, but to generations she would never meet. This is where her story quietly stops being about finance and starts becoming something much larger. People often say that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. They're only partly right. Money compounds, but so does generosity. One act of kindness inspired another. That kindness created an education. That education created an opportunity. That opportunity created wealth. And that wealth created opportunities for thousands more. The investment didn't begin with Abbott Laboratories. It began with compassion. Today, investors still debate which company will become the next great stock, which industry will dominate the next decade, which technology will create the next generation of millionaires. Grace's story asks a different question. What kind of person will you become while you're waiting? Because time doesn't only grow portfolios. It reveals character. Anyone can stay invested when markets are rising. Very few can remain calm when uncertainty feels overwhelming. Grace did, not because she was fearless, but because she understood something timeless. Real wealth is built by decisions that feel painfully ordinary while you're making them. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, until one day, the world calls you an overnight success, even though your success took a lifetime. Perhaps that's why Grace Groner's story still resonates today. In an age of instant gratification, she proved that patience remains one of the rarest competitive advantages on earth. She never became famous. She never wrote a best-selling book. She never stood on a stage teaching people how to build wealth. Yet her life became one of the clearest demonstrations of a truth that markets have repeated for centuries. Extraordinary results rarely come from extraordinary moments. They come from ordinary decisions, made consistently, for an extraordinarily long time. So the next time you hear someone searching for the perfect investment, remember Grace, because the most valuable thing she ever owned wasn't Abbott Laboratories stock. It was the discipline to leave a good decision alone. If this story changed the way you think about investing, patience, or success, share it with someone who's chasing quick results. And if you want more true financial stories built from history, not hype, subscribe to Money Elevate. Because sometimes, the greatest fortunes aren't the ones people see. They're the ones quietly growing, while everyone else is looking somewhere else.